I dialed my son's number on a Thursday morning in April, and when he picked up, I told him I had 6 months to live. Not with tears in my voice, not with the shake of a man who has just heard the word stage 4 from a doctor and hasn't slept since. I said it the way you report a fact you've already made your peace with, evenly, holding my phone in the kitchen where I've made coffee every morning for 31 years. I said, Marcus, I need you to sit down. The scan came back. It's pancreatic. They're telling me 6 months, maybe less. I listened to the silence on the other end. My son, my 41-year-old son who I raised in this house, who I taught to throw a curveball in the backyard, who sat across from me at 10,000 dinners over the years, said 4 words before he had time to build anything around them. He said, "So, when's the funeral?" Then, he caught himself. He said he misspoke. He said he meant to ask when I'd know more, when we'd have a plan, when he could come see me. He talked fast for the next 2 minutes, backfilling the sentence with concern the way a man shovels dirt over something he didn't mean to dig up. But I'd heard it already. 4 words, clean and unrehearsed, spoken by a man whose mind had gone straight to the only practical question that mattered to him. Not, "Are you scared?" Not, "What do the doctors say? When's the funeral?" I did not have cancer. There was no scan. I had built the entire diagnosis from nothing because something had been sitting wrong in my gut for the better part of a year, and I needed to know, once and for all, exactly what my older son would do with the news that his father was dying. He had just answered that question in 4 words, and he'd failed it in the specific and permanent way a man fails when the truth gets out of him before he remembers he's supposed to be hiding it. What I found out 2 days later, sitting in my truck outside his office building, was worse than the funeral question by more than I can measure. Hey, everybody, thanks for spending some time with me today. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, and if this story pulls you in, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. Let's get into it. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 68 years old, and I live outside Spokane, Washington, on 11 acres. My father bought in 1962 for less money than a used car costs today. I spent 36 years running Briggs Heavy Equipment Rental, a business I started with 1 backhoe and a rusted flatbed trailer, and grew into a company with 3 lots, 60 pieces of equipment, and contracts with construction outfits across the eastern half of the state. I sold it 4 years ago to a national leasing company for a sum that would surprise most folks who knew me only as the quiet guy who fixed his own fence posts. I'll tell you that number before this story's done. It matters. My wife, Carol, passed almost 5 years back. Ovarian cancer, the real kind, the kind I'm only pretending to have now, and I want to say that plainly, because there's something uncomfortable about building a fake version of the thing that actually took the woman I loved for 42 years. I thought about that discomfort for a long time before I went through with this test, and I'll tell you honestly, I'm still not sure I made peace with it. But I needed to know what I needed to know, and I didn't see another road to it. Carol ran the books for Briggs Heavy Equipment for 19 years. She had a mind for numbers that made mine look like a child's, and between her ledger and my ability to talk a contractor into a 3-year lease over a cup of gas station coffee, we built something real. After she died, I ran the business alone for a year and a half, then sold it, because a company built by 2 people doesn't run right on one for long, not when the one left standing is grieving. Marcus is my older boy, 41, lives in Coeur d'Alene, about 40 minutes across the state line, works in commercial real estate, specifically in acquisitions, which is a polite way of saying he spends his working life figuring out what things are worth before the people who own them figure it out first. He's got Carol's quick tongue and my stubborn jaw, and for a long time I mistook the tongue for warmth, because it's a smooth thing to listen to when it's aimed in your direction and you're not looking for the seams. My younger boy, Nathaniel, is 37. He lives closer, just outside Spokane proper, works as a physical therapist at the VA hospital, and calls me every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock sharp, a habit he's kept for going on 5 years without missing a week, except once, when he called 40 minutes late because he'd stayed behind with a veteran patient who was having a hard night and didn't want to be alone in it. He apologized for being late to a phone call nobody but him was keeping score on. That tells you the shape of Nathaniel, and it's a shape I didn't fully appreciate until I had something to measure it against. Nathaniel didn't know anything about the test. Nobody did, not my accountant, not my attorney, not my old fishing partner Gerald, who I told everything eventually, but only once the whole business had already run its course. I built this alone, over about 6 weeks in the early spring, because something had been gathering in me long enough that I couldn't keep looking past it. It started small, the way these things do. A remark Marcus made in passing about how much land I was sitting on out here, and whether I'd thought about what happens to 11 acres when a man my age isn't around to mow it anymore. A question about the sale of the business, whether the money had come in one lump or been spread out over years for tax reasons. A comment from Nathaniel, offered, without any suspicion in it at all, that Marcus had called him a few months back just checking in on how I was doing health-wise, whether I'd been to the doctor lately. Nathaniel hadn't thought anything of it. Nathaniel rarely thought anything of what Marcus did, because Nathaniel had spent his whole life extending his older brother a kind of credit that Marcus kept drawing on and never once paid back. I noticed the pattern before I had a name for it, and once I had the name, I couldn't set it back down. So I built the test. I sat down with my accountant, a sharp, quiet woman named Ruth Callahan, who'd handled my books since before Carol died, and I asked her to help me put together a single sheet of paper. Not a forged document, nothing anyone would need to notarize, just a plausible outline of a man whose finances had gone sideways in the years since selling his business, bad investments, a struggling annuity, medical bills from a wife's illness that had eaten further into savings than people assumed. It was for my own benefit, so that when I sat down with Marcus, I'd have the numbers straight in my head and wouldn't stumble on a detail. I called Marcus on a Tuesday and asked if he could drive out that Thursday morning, told him I had something serious to talk to him about. He said, of course, and he called back 40 minutes later to confirm the time again, which struck me even then as the behavior of a man clearing his schedule for something he considered important. I told him over the phone, not in person, because the diagnosis I'd invented called for a doctor's appointment that morning, and I wanted the timing to feel real. I told him about the 6 months. I told him about the pancreatic scan, and he said, "So when's the funeral?" before he caught the sentence and tried to drag it back inside himself. The 2 minutes of scrambling that followed were almost more revealing than the 4 words themselves, because I could hear him doing the math in real time, recalculating, trying to fold a careless sentence into something that sounded like a son in shock rather than a son already 3 steps ahead. I've spent 36 years listening to men calculate the value of things over a handshake, and Marcus was calculating fast, but not fast enough, not for a man who'd built his own gut instinct on exactly this kind of listening. We stayed on the phone another half hour after that. He said he'd come out this weekend. He said not to make any big decisions about the property without talking to him first, since he knew people in land valuation who could tell us what 11 acres out here was really worth in this market. He said we. I told him I appreciated it. I told him I'd see him this weekend. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long while, looking out at the tree line Carol used to watch the deer come through in the evenings. I thought the test had ended with that phone call. I thought what I needed to know was whether my son's first instinct, faced with his father's death, would be grief or arithmetic. And I had my answer, plain as anything, in 4 words I hadn't been able to shake since he said them. I was wrong about where the test ended. What I found 2 days later showed me I hadn't been testing the right thing at all. If you're still with me, drop a comment, hit that like button, because what happened in that parking lot on Saturday morning is the reason this story doesn't end with a phone call about a funeral. I'm not a man who sits still well. 36 years of getting up before 5 to open the equipment lot does something to your body that retirement doesn't undo. I still wake before dawn most mornings, and that Saturday, unable to shake the 4 words Marcus had said on the phone, I found myself driving into Coeur d'Alene before I'd decided I was going to. I told myself I was going to see his office, just to look at the building where my son spent his days, the way a man drives past his old high school, sometimes without any real plan behind it. I parked across the street from the low brick building where his firm keeps its offices, and I was about to pull back out of the lot when I saw Marcus's truck pull in, early on a Saturday, and another car pull in right behind his, a sedan I didn't recognize. A man got out of it that I didn't know, younger than Marcus, wearing the kind of casual blazer that men wear when they want to look serious without looking like they tried. I sat in my truck. I don't entirely know why I didn't start the engine and drive home. I told myself I was curious. I think, If I'm honest, some part of me already suspected there was a second layer to this, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes before I let myself believe it. My windows were down, it being a mild spring morning, and the two of them stood by Marcus's truck close enough, and the parking lot quiet enough, that the wind carried their conversation to me clean as anything. Marcus said, "He's terminal. Pancreatic. Doctor gave him 6 months, maybe less. I need us to move on the acreage before he starts thinking about a will he hasn't touched since my mother died." The other man said something I couldn't catch, and Marcus said, "No, listen, 11 acres out there, unincorporated, no zoning restrictions on record. That land is worth 400, 425 if we take our time and go through a broker. But if I get in front of it now, as his son, present a private offer as a favor before he's dealing with hospice and lawyers and all of it, I can get him to sign at 280, 290. He trusts me. He's not going to get an appraisal on his deathbed." The man said something else, quieter, and Marcus said, "My brother's not a problem. Nathaniel's not going to ask questions. He never has. I'll tell him it's what Dad wanted. Keep things simple. Avoid a mess of legal fees while Dad's sick. He'll go along with it. He always does." I sat in that truck with both hands on the wheel and didn't move. Marcus kept talking, said something about needing 6 weeks to get the private offer paperwork together, said the medical bills alone would make an old man desperate enough to take a fast, clean number over a slow, complicated one. Said he already had a lender lined up to front the difference once they flipped the parcel to a developer eyeing the county's new highway corridor. The other man laughed at something, and Marcus laughed with him. Easy, the laugh of a man who believes the hard part is already behind him. I do not know how long I sat there after they went inside. Long enough that my coffee had gone cold in the cup holder. Long enough to understand that the 4 words on the phone hadn't been the whole test result. They'd only been the first crack in a wall that had a great deal more behind it. My son believed I was dying. My son believed I was desperate. And my son had built, apparently over some real stretch of time, a plan to take advantage of both those beliefs at once, and to do it in a way that specifically walked around his younger brother rather than through him. I drove home. I did not call Marcus. I called Nathaniel instead, and he picked up on the second ring, even though it wasn't Sunday, even though it wasn't 6 o'clock, because something in the way I said his name told him this call was different. He said, "Dad, what's wrong?" I told him everything. I told him about the fake diagnosis, and I heard him go quiet in a particular way, the quiet of a man absorbing that his father had lied to him too, even for a good reason. I told him about the 4 words on the phone, and then I told him what I'd heard in that parking lot, the acreage, the 280, the lender, the line about Nathaniel never asking questions. Nathaniel didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "He told me you'd talk to him about maybe simplifying things before you got sicker. He said you didn't want a bunch of paperwork and lawyers eating into what was left." "When did he tell you that?" I said. 2 months ago, Nathaniel said. "He said you two had talked about it and you wanted him to handle the details so I wouldn't have to worry about it while I was working." 2 months. Marcus had been laying that groundwork with his brother 2 full months before I ever picked up the phone with my fake diagnosis, which meant the plan hadn't started with my lie at all. It had been sitting there waiting, and my test had simply given him the trigger he needed to move it forward faster than he'd planned. Nathaniel said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep this between us for now," I said, "and I need the name of somebody who can help me sort out my affairs the right way. Somebody good." He gave me a name inside of a minute, a woman named Diane Kessler, an estate attorney with an office in downtown Spokane, who Nathaniel had used 2 years back when he'd set up his own small trust for his kids. Nathaniel was the kind of man who had the right name ready before you knew to ask for it, not because he was scheming, but because he paid attention and filed things away for when they'd matter. I called Diane Kessler on Monday morning. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the whole thing, the fake diagnosis, the phone call, the parking lot, the $425,000 land that my son intended to buy off me for $280. When I finished, she asked me one question. "Mr. Briggs, do you have documentation of what this land is actually worth and of the sale of your business? Something concrete." I told her I had the closing paperwork from the sale of Briggs Heavy Equipment and an accountant who'd handled my books for over a decade. "Good," she said. And the conversation in the parking lot, did you record it? I hadn't thought to. I told her that. She was quiet a beat. All right. The comment about the funeral, combined with what you overheard and the real numbers on that property, gives us more than enough to work with, even without a recording. What I want to do first is get an independent appraisal on that acreage this week, get your full asset picture documented and notarized, and revise your estate plan before your son takes another step toward whatever he's building. I asked how soon she could see me. Wednesday, she said. 9 o'clock. I was there at 8:45. Diane Kessler turned out to be exactly what her voice on the phone had suggested. Calm, exact, entirely unhurried, a woman who had clearly walked other families through this same ugly hallway before and knew precisely where each door led. She had a legal pad and she filled 2 pages while I talked. And when I finished, she read back a list of what she needed: the business sale documents, a full accounting from Ruth, current estate paperwork, and a dated, signed account of everything I'd overheard, written as close to word for word as I could manage. I asked her how much that written account would carry without a recording behind it. Combined with the appraisal and the real financial picture, it carries real weight, she said. You're not filing a police report today, Mr. Briggs. Not yet, anyway. Today we're documenting the truth of your finances and updating your estate to reflect it. The parking lot conversation is context. The foundation is the numbers. The numbers, once Ruth and Diane had them laid out together by that Friday, were substantial. Briggs Heavy Equipment had sold 4 years back for $2.1 million, split between an upfront payment and a 4-year earnout, 3 years of which had already been paid in full. The 11 acres, independently appraised that same week, came back at $430,000, slightly higher even than Marcus had guessed in that parking lot. Retirement accounts and investments Carol and I had built over 4 decades of careful living added another $900,000. All told, just under $3.4 million, held by a man his older son believed was dying broke and desperate enough to sign away his land for $280,000 to avoid a slow, complicated death. I want you to sit with that gap for a second. $150,000 minimum spread, minimum, in my son's favor, on a piece of land he intended to flip within months to a developer he already had lined up, built entirely on the belief that his dying father wouldn't think to check a number before signing it away. Diane finished revising my estate documents inside of a week. I want to be clear about what changed and what didn't, because both halves matter to this story. What didn't change was Nathaniel's share. He'd earned every bit of it honestly across 37 years of being exactly the kind of son he'd always been, and nothing I'd learned altered that 1 inch. What changed was Marcus's position, not erased, but restructured to something honest, a specific sum that accounted for the money I'd already quietly loaned him over the years and never seen returned, support he'd never once acknowledged, leaving him something, but not the 11 acres he'd been circling for months. The land itself went into a trust, with Diane as independent trustee, unsellable without her written approval, and a fresh independent appraisal on any offer, with an explicit clause that no family member could stand as buyer or as the buyer's agent on any transaction involving that property. Nathaniel was named co-trustee alongside her. I called him the evening the papers were filed and told him. He was quiet, then he said, "Dad, you didn't have to put my name on that." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I did it." The documents were signed, notarized, and filed on a Friday, 11 days after I'd told my son I had 6 months to live and he'd asked me when the funeral was. On Saturday morning, I called Marcus. "If you're still with me, drop that comment, tell me what you'd have said in my shoes, and hit like, because how I told him is the part of this I thought longest and hardest about getting right." Marcus answered before the second ring finished, the way a man answers when he's been keeping his phone close all week, waiting. "Dad," he said, warm, quick, "how you feeling? I've been thinking about you nonstop." "I'm feeling fine," I said. "Better than fine, actually. Can you come by this afternoon? I want to update you on some things." "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need." He was at my door at 2:50 for a 3 o'clock I'd set. He came in wearing that same easy warmth he'd worn all week, a man who believes the situation is bending in the direction he built it to bend. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, The one Carol and I bought secondhand in 1987 and never once replaced because neither of us saw the point in replacing something that still did its job. I said, Marcus, before I tell you anything else, I want you to hear something true. I love you. That doesn't change no matter what I say next, and I want that understood before we go any further. Something shifted behind his eyes. Small, involuntary. The first sign that this wasn't the conversation he'd shown up expecting. I don't have cancer, I said. There was no scan. I made it up because I needed to find out something, and I found it out. The business is fine. The land is fine. Nobody's dying and nobody's signing anything to anybody at $280,000. Silence. His hands went flat on the table. I needed to know what you'd do with the news that I was dying, I said, and you told me before you had a chance to manage it. 4 words, Marcus. When's the funeral? That told me everything I needed, and I hadn't even gotten to the second part yet. Dad, Saturday morning, I said. I was parked across the street from your office. I heard the whole conversation. 425, 280, the lender you've got lined up, the line about your brother never asking questions. I heard all of it. His face went the particular gray of a man rebuilding an entire week in his head in real time and watching the reconstruction collapse under him as he goes. He didn't try to talk his way around it, and I'll give him that much, because a lesser man sits there and starts inventing a story about what I must have misheard. Marcus just looked at the coffee mug in front of him and went quiet, which told me something about what was left in him that I hadn't been sure was still there. The land's in a trust now, I said. Diane Kessler handled it. Your brother's the co-trustee. Nobody sells that property to a family member, ever, full stop. He closed his eyes. Did you tell Nathaniel, he said, about what I said, about him not asking questions? I told your brother everything, I said. He opened his eyes and looked at the table for a long time. Marcus, I said, I'm going to tell you what I told Diane I needed from you, which is the same thing I need from you now, the truth. Not the managed version, not the version built for whoever's listening. What's actually going on with you? Because a son doesn't build a plan like that against a father he believes is dying, unless something's got its hands around his throat already. A long pause, the kind with real weight sitting inside it. Are you in trouble? I said. Yes, he said. Tell me, I said. And he did. Not all in one clean piece, but slowly. The way truth comes out of a man who's been sitting on it a long while, with stops and restarts. A commercial development he'd gotten into 2 years back on the strength of interest rates that didn't hold, a second deal he'd taken on to try to cover the first, personal guarantees signed on both that meant the exposure wasn't just professional, it was his house, his savings, everything. He wasn't broke yet, but he could see broke coming, close enough that my 11 acres had started looking less like his father's land and more like a bridge over a river he was already halfway into. I let him finish without interrupting. When he was done, I sat with it a moment. You should have called me 8 months ago, I said, not to take something from me, to ask. There's a version of this where you called and said, Dad, I'm in over my head, and we'd have had a very different 8 months than the one we just had. I paused. I don't know if I'd have bailed you out. I want to be honest with you about that. What you were building, the fake urgency, the plan to cut your brother out of the conversation entirely, that tells me something about your judgment I'm still sitting with. But I'd have listened. We'd have had the conversation. Marcus put his hand over his eyes and sat like that a while. Dad, he said, I'm sorry. I believe you are, I said. The trust, he said, what you set up. It's honest, I said. It reflects things as they actually stand between us right now. If that changes over the years ahead, I'll revisit it, because this was never about punishing you. It's about accuracy. And accuracy starts today, with the truth. And the truth is that what you built wasn't the plan of a son who trusted his father to still be worth something to talk to. He nodded slowly. Where do I start? He said. With your own lawyer, I said. Tomorrow, before anything else, and you give them the whole picture, not the managed one. He nodded again. And then you call your brother, I said. Not me calling to tell him what you said about him. You call him yourself. Marcus looked at the table a long moment. He's going to hate me for a while, he said. Yes, I said. He's going to be angry, and then he's going to listen. because Nathaniel has always been better at both of those things than either of us gave him credit for over the years. Marcus left a little after 5. I stood at my kitchen window and watched his truck pull down the gravel drive and out past the tree line Carol used to watch the deer cross in the evenings. And I stood there a good while longer after he was gone, looking at the acreage, the fence posts I'd reset myself 2 summers back, the old maple near the property line that Carol had planted the year Nathaniel was born and that had gotten enormous in the particular way trees do when you stop noticing them for a decade at a stretch. I called Nathaniel. He picked up on the second ring. I told him his brother would be calling. He was quiet. Then he said, "How'd he seem when he left?" "Like a man who put something heavy down," I said, "and isn't sure yet what to do with his hands now that they're empty." Nathaniel made a small sound, half a laugh, half something sadder than that. "That sounds about right," he said. We talked another half hour about other things, about his youngest starting kindergarten in the fall, about a veteran he'd been working with at the VA who'd finally walked the length of the hallway without his cane for the first time in 8 months, about the maple tree, which Nathaniel hadn't seen since the winter, and which I described as getting a little wild at the crown, and the good way trees get wild when nobody's stopped them. When we hung up, I went out to the back porch and sat in the chair Carol used to take her coffee in every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, and I looked out at the land and breathed for a good long while. The acreage was still mine. The documents were accurate. The number Marcus had built his whole plan around would never appear on any offer sheet, not now, not ever, because the trust made that conversation permanently moot. And 40 minutes across the state line, my older son was sitting somewhere with the weight of what he'd just set down, trying to figure out what a man does with his hands once the scheme he'd been carrying finally hits the ground. I didn't know what came next for Marcus. That part belonged to him now, to his own attorney, to his brother, to the actual shape of his debts once the managed version got put away for good. I'd made clear what I could work with and what I couldn't, and the rest of it was his road to walk. What I knew, sitting in Carol's chair with the evening coming down over the ridge, was this. The test I'd built had cost me more than I'd bargained for, not in dollars, but in the particular expensive way that clear sight always costs more than a comfortable blur, because uncertainty lets a man keep believing the version of his son he prefers, and clarity makes him live in the version that's actually true. Marcus had failed that test in the worst way a man can fail it, and then, sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, he'd done the one thing the test was never built to measure, which was to tell the truth. Once the truth was the only thing left in the room worth saying. That wasn't nothing. It wasn't forgiveness either, but it wasn't nothing. I went back inside. I watered the plants Carol used to keep on the windowsill, the ones I still can't bring myself to let die. I made dinner and sat down to eat it at the table instead of standing at the counter the way I do most nights alone, and I thought about a woman who ran the books for a heavy equipment company for 19 years with a sharpness and a warmth I never came close to matching on my own, and who, I suspect, I would have seen straight through her older boy long before any of this ever got as far as a fake diagnosis and a parking lot. She'd have handled it different than I did, I imagine. Less scheme, more straight talk. More warmth in the confrontation and less architecture built up around it. She'd probably have been right to do it that way. But she wasn't here to do it her way, and I did it the only way I knew how, which was to build something sturdy, make sure it held, and write down exactly what it held once it was done. It held. That was enough. If this one stuck with you, tell me in the comments which moment changed the room for you. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. And if you've ever wondered what's actually sitting underneath the warmth of somebody who's been asking a few too many questions about what you own, let me tell you what a man who built a company out of one backhoe learned on an April morning in his own kitchen. You don't need a recording. You just need to give somebody a reason to say the wrong thing before they remember they're supposed to be hiding it. The truth's got a way of getting out ahead of the person it belongs to.